In a packed African courtroom, where tension hung thicker than the dusty afternoon heat, no one paid much attention to the quiet black woman standing alone at the defendant's table. Dressed simply, with no lawyer by her side and no family present, she seemed like just another ordinary citizen tangled in the system. Officers whispered, smirked, and exchanged mocking glances, already convinced she was beneath them. But hidden behind her calm eyes was a strength they had not yet seen. As the murmurs filled the room and the judge prepared to rush through yet another case, the unthinkable happened. One impatient officer, irritated by the woman's unwavering composure and refusal to be intimidated, suddenly slapped her across the face in full view of the court. Gasps erupted. The room froze. Yet the woman didn't raise her voice or her hand. She simply lifted her gaze and stared at the officer with a silence more powerful than any scream. Seconds later, as confusion still rippled through the courtroom, the judge's phone rang sharply. What he heard on the other end made his face drain of color. The high-ranking judicial official they had all been expecting of, woman sent to oversee misconduct in the district, had already arrived, and she was standing right there in his courtroom. Before anyone could process the revelation, the quiet woman stepped away from the defendant's table and, with a dignity that commanded the entire room, walked straight toward the judge's bench. Every officer, clerk, and witness pulled back as the truth hit them. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, and assaulted was the newly appointed judge sent to expose corruption. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as she took her rightful seat, no longer the accused, but the one who would decide the fate of everyone who had wronged her. Adjoa Mensah never imagined her day would begin with handcuffs digging into her wrists. She had simply been walking home from the community center, where she volunteered to mentor young boys from troubled neighborhoods, when she noticed two officers harassing a frightened 12-year-old boy near a street stall. The child had been accused of stealing bread, though his trembling denial was clear and desperate. Adjoa stepped forward calmly, trying to defuse the situation. She asked the officers if the stall owner had verified the theft, if they had followed procedure, and if the boy's parents had been contacted. Her voice wasn't confrontational, just firm, respectful, and measured. But the officers didn't care. One saw her questions as disrespect, another felt his authority challenged. They ordered her to step back. She refused to leave the boy alone and insisted on proper protocol, reminding them that intimidation was not lawful procedure. Annoyed, embarrassed, and irritated by her confidence, the officers made the decision that would ruin their careers. They arrested her without reason, handcuffing her as a crowd watched. Some recorded, but no one intervened. The boy cried, begging them to release her. Adjoa simply looked at him and smiled softly, telling him not to be afraid. She didn't argue, didn't resist. She only observed everything with eyes that seemed to memorize every detail. As she was pushed into the police car, the officers muttered insults, assuming she was just another civilian sticking her nose where it didn't belong. But deep inside, Adjoa felt no anger, only disappointment. For years she had investigated misconduct from afar, waiting for the day she would walk into the system to fix it from within. She didn't know it would begin so suddenly, or so violently. The courtroom she was dragged into the next morning felt nothing like a place meant for justice. It buzzed with impatience, paperwork slapped onto desks, and officers swaggering around as though the room belonged to them. Defendants sat with tired eyes, knowing their fate would be decided in minutes, not by truth, but by convenience. The judge, an aging man with a stern face and an even sterner ego, didn't bother looking up when Adjoa was escorted in. He simply gestured for the officers to place her with the others waiting for judgment. She remained quiet, observing the patterns. Lawyers who rushed cases, clerks who whispered about bribes, officers who joked loudly about intimidating suspects. No one expected this woman in a simple dress, with no lawyer and no family present, to be anyone important. She was treated like the lowest in the room. The officers who arrested her strutted forward, preparing their statements with smug confidence. They believed they had the judge's favor. After all, they always did. Ajoa watched them calmly, recognizing faces she had seen in misconduct reports before. Their corruption was deep-rooted, their arrogance decades old. Yet none of them realized who they had brought into the courtroom. As she took a seat on the defendant's bench, some spectators glanced at her with pity, others with indifference. To them, she was just another case in a long line of forgotten citizens. But Ajoa noticed everything: the missing documents, the frightened defendants, the dismissive tone of the judge. This court was not just dysfunctional, it was dangerous. And today, fate had placed her in the center of it. She knew that sometimes, to change a broken system, you must sit inside it first. And she was ready. When her case was called, Ajoa rose with quiet confidence. The officers marched forward eagerly, ready to paint her as a troublemaker. One claimed she had obstructed an investigation. Another accused her of inciting a crowd. Their statements were exaggerated, inconsistent, and fueled by their desire to punish her for challenging them. The judge barely listened. He simply nodded, ready to mark another guilty verdict. But then Ajoa spoke. Her voice was calm but steady, commanding the room without raising its volume. She asked the judge if she could clarify the events. The officers instantly scoffed. "You'll speak when spoken to," one barked. The judge waved lazily, allowing her only a few seconds. Ajoa described the scene with precision. How she had asked the officers to verify the accusation. How the stall owner had not confirmed theft. How the boys' rights were ignored. Her composure irritated the officers further. One stepped forward aggressively, telling her she was lucky they didn't charge her with more. The judge frowned, not at the officer's behavior, but at Ajoa for talking too much. She tried to present her right to legal representation, but the judge dismissed it, saying the court was too busy for formalities. The spectators murmured, some shocked at the judge's disregard for due process. But the officers were beyond irritated. To them, this woman was not afraid enough, not submissive enough, not put in her place. One officer leaned close and whispered something insulting, loud enough for the room to hear. The judge's hands trembled as he held the phone to his ear. On the other end was the Chief Justice himself, a man who rarely called lower courts, unless something monumental was happening. The message was brief, but earth-shattering. Our newly appointed High Court Justice has arrived. She was supposed to be escorted discreetly, but it appears she chose to walk in unannounced. She will observe your proceedings today. Treat her with utmost respect. The judge swallowed hard. His eyes drifted slowly, fearfully, toward the woman standing silently at the defendant's bench. He replayed every detail. Her calm voice, her intelligence, her composure under pressure. He felt his heartbeat pound in his ears. Was it possible? Had they just assaulted someone sent to evaluate them? Someone with the authority to shut down the entire court. The officers had no idea what was happening. They assumed the judge's sudden stiffness was directed at Ajoa. "Should we continue, sir?" one officer asked arrogantly. The judge didn't answer. Instead, he stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. The spectators watched with wide eyes as he stared at Ajoa, sweat forming on his brow. The room waited. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Madam," the judge stammered, his voice cracking. May I confirm your full name?" Ajoa didn't move for a moment. Then, with a quiet breath, she reached into her pocket and placed a small official ID card on the table. The courtroom clerk picked it up, read it, and gasped so loudly the sound echoed like a shout. The truth was out. Officers froze. Spectators leaned forward. The judge nearly collapsed into his chair. The woman they had mocked, arrested, slapped was not a defendant. She was the new High Court Justice sent to expose corruption in this very courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as the clerk shakily handed the ID to the judge. The old man's hands trembled so violently that the card nearly slipped from his fingers. The bold letters on it were unmistakable. Justice Adjoa Mensah, a name that had already become famous across reform circles. A name officers whispered about cautiously. A name associated with accountability. The officers stared at her as though seeing a ghost. The one who slapped her felt his knees weaken. He stumbled backward until he hit the wall. No, this can't be," he muttered, his arrogance dissolving into panic. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice cracked weakly. Your Honor, I apologize. We were not informed." Adjoa raised a hand gently, signaling him to stop speaking. The entire room fell silent. She stepped forward, not with anger, not with pride, but with a quiet authority that filled every corner of the courtroom. "Everything that happened here today," she said calmly, "happened exactly as I needed to see it." Her words cut deeper than any shout could. Officers exchanged terrified glances. Spectators held their breath. She continued, "This court was selected for review based on numerous reports of misconduct, intimidation, and corruption. I chose to arrive without announcement to see the truth for myself." She looked directly at the officer who slapped her. He looked away, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "And today," Adjoa said softly, "you have shown me more than any report ever could." The judge lowered his head in shame, knowing the consequences would be severe. Adjoa picked up her ID and placed it back into her pocket. Then she uttered the words that cemented the moment forever. "I will now take my position." And the courtroom erupted into stunned silence as she walked toward the judge's bench. As Adjoa approached the bench, everyone instinctively stepped aside, not because she demanded it, but because her presence made it impossible to stand in her way. The judge scrambled down from his seat, nearly tripping over his robe as he moved aside. For the first time all morning, true authority entered the courtroom. Adjoa ascended the steps one at a time, her movements slow and deliberate. She lowered herself into the judge's chair, its polished wood gleaming under the courtroom lights, and the room collectively held its breath. The transformation was surreal. Moments ago, she had stood as a defendant, mocked, dismissed, assaulted. Now she sat in the highest seat of power, commanding the entire room without uttering a single word. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried the undeniable weight of justice. "Court is now under my authority." The officers stiffened. The spectators straightened. Even the clerks who once whispered gossipy remarks now stared in reverent silence. Adjoa looked down at the documents concerning her arrest. She lifted them with graceful fingers, scanning each line. "These charges," she said slowly, "are fabricated." And the arrest was unlawful. The officer who slapped her felt his vision blur. Sweat trickled down his face. She continued, "Before any further cases are heard, this courtroom must address the misconduct displayed today." The tension was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. Then, in a voice that carried both disappointment and unshakable strength, she delivered the words everyone feared. "Bring forward every report filed against the officers present. Beginning now, this courtroom is under review." Her declarations. When the final testimony ended, Adjoa leaned back in the judge's chair, her expression unreadable. The courtroom remained frozen, waiting for her decision. She began with a statement that was not emotional, not dramatic, just factual. "The actions displayed by the officers in this courtroom," she said slowly, "are not isolated incidents. They represent a systemic failure, one that has harmed countless citizens." She paused, allowing her words to settle heavily on every shoulder in the room. "Effective immediately," she continued, "the officers responsible for assault, unlawful arrest, and falsifying reports are suspended pending a full investigation. They are to be escorted from this courtroom to internal affairs." The officers broke. Some tried to plead, others burst into tears, and one collapsed into a chair, unable to breathe from panic. But Adjoa remained composed, not cruel, simply just. She then addressed the judge, who had ignored due process. Your position requires fairness, dignity, and respect for the law. Today, you failed in all three. The judge's face crumpled. He lowered his head as she announced a formal inquiry into his conduct as well. Several spectators clapped under their breath. Others cried, some in relief, some in awe. Adjoa wasn't done. She ordered the release of all defendants whose charges were manipulated by corrupt officers. She requested an immediate audit of every case handled by the courtroom in the past 3 years. Her decisions were sweeping, decisive, and irreversible. By the time she finished, the courtroom had transformed from a place of oppression into a beacon of accountability. The officers who once swaggered with arrogance now walked out in silence, escorted like the criminals they had treated others as. And through it all, Adjoa never once raised her voice. Her justice was quiet, but absolute. When the room finally settled, Adjoa stood, not as a victim of the court's cruelty, but as its reformer. She surveyed the faces before her defendants who had lost hope, citizens who expected nothing from the system, clerks who had grown numb, and officials who now understood that justice was not optional. She spoke with the humility of someone who believed deeply in the purpose of her work. Today, she began, is not about punishing individuals alone. It is about correcting a culture that allowed injustice to flourish. Her words were soft, but they carried through every corner of the room. Power, she continued, is not measured by how loudly you speak or how harshly you command. Power is measured by your integrity, by how you treat those who cannot defend themselves. The crowd listened with reverence. Even those who once doubted her felt renewed respect. I stood before you this morning as a defendant, she said, not because I committed a crime, but because I needed to see how this courtroom truly operates when no one is watching. She paused. Now, everyone is watching. Her statement would later appear on national news, inspiring debates across the country about police reform, courtroom ethics, and the treatment of ordinary citizens. As she prepared to adjourn, she offered one final message. Let this day remind us that dignity belongs to all, not just those in uniforms or seats of power. When she struck the gavel, the sound echoed like a promise of a new beginning, a promise that justice, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The spectators rose to their feet, not because tradition required it, but because respect compelled them. Adjoa left the courtroom exactly as she had entered it, calm, steady, and quietly powerful. But the world she walked into would never be the same. In the quiet that followed the final strike of the gavel, the courtroom stood transformed. What began as a stage for corruption had become a lesson the entire nation would remember. As Justice Adjoa walked out through the same doors she entered, once dragged in as a supposed criminal, now leaving as the force that restored integrity, every person in the room felt the weight of what they had witnessed. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't retaliated. She had shown that true strength stands steady even in the face of humiliation, and true justice does not bend to intimidation or fear. The officers who once believed they ruled the courtroom learned the hardest truth of all. Power is meaningless when used to oppress, but unstoppable when used to protect. And for every silent victim who ever sat in that courtroom hopeless and unheard, today was a message change doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing the face of someone no one bothered to respect. As Adjoa stepped outside into the sunlight, people gathered, whispering her name with awe, not because she exposed wrongdoing, but because she did it with dignity, restraint, and purpose. Her story became more than a courtroom incident. It became a symbol of hope for those who believed justice had forgotten them. It reminded the world that the smallest act of courage, even standing up for a child on the street, can ignite a revolution in places where truth has been buried for years. And so, the tale of the woman who entered court as a defendant but left as a judge will continue to echo across cities and generations. A reminder that no matter how dark a room becomes, all it takes is one person, fearless, principled, unwavering, to turn the light back on.